One pharaoh sat on Egypt's throne for so long that entire generations of soldiers, priests, and officials were born, lived full lives, grew old, and died of entirely natural causes while he remained ruling above them, without a single interruption, the entire time. By the time he finally died, traditionally said to be after 94 uninterrupted years on the throne, the great civilization beneath him had quietly rotted from the inside out, almost without anyone in power ever fully noticing it happening in real time as it unfolded around them. Ancient Egypt's old kingdom didn't collapse because of war, foreign invasion, or open rebellion, the way most ancient civilizations eventually did. It collapsed because one man simply refused to stop being pharaoh for longer than almost any other ruler anywhere in recorded human history. To understand how simply staying in power for that unimaginably long could actually destroy a kingdom instead of strengthening it, the way most people would naturally assume long stability would, you first have to go back to the exact moment this particular pharaoh's reign first began. His name was Pepi II, and he inherited the throne of Egypt at an age when most children today would still be in elementary school, roughly 6 years old, following the sudden and unexpected death of his predecessor, Marinera I, who had ruled only briefly himself. Because an actual 6-year-old child obviously couldn't run a kingdom of that size on his own, his mother, Ankhesen Pepi II, almost certainly stepped in as regent during those earliest years, quietly managing the day-to-day machinery of the Egyptian state on her young son's behalf until he came of age. The Egypt that young Pepi inherited was, by nearly every available measure, still one of the wealthiest, most centralized, and most genuinely impressive civilizations anywhere on the entire planet at that particular point in human history. The pyramids of earlier 6th dynasty kings still stood as physical, undeniable proof of what a strong, genuinely unified central government under a single capable pharaoh could organize, fund, and accomplish across the entire length of the Nile Valley. One of the clearest and most personal surviving glimpses into young Pepi's early reign comes from a remarkable letter written by a nobleman and seasoned expedition leader named Harkhuf, who had been sent deep south into Nubia on official business for the crown. Harkhuf wrote back directly to the 9-year-old pharaoh describing, among the various goods and treasures collected on the expedition, a captured dancing dwarf, most likely a pygmy from deep within Africa, that he was personally bringing home to the Egyptian court. The young king's excited reply survives to this day, carved into stone for later generations to read, practically vibrating with childlike anticipation and repeatedly instructing Harkhuf to guard the dwarf carefully day and night on the long journey home. It's an oddly touching, deeply human moment preserved across thousands of years. A real child, temporarily forgetting the weight and formality of his own royal position entirely, simply excited about something wonderful and strange arriving from far away. It also proves something important about this early period of the reign. The Egyptian state still functioned exactly as it should, sending well-organized expeditions hundreds of miles south into unfamiliar territory and coordinating them efficiently all the way back to the throne itself. But that same boy on the throne did not simply grow up, rule for a normal, expected span of years, and then hand power smoothly to a successor the way most earlier Egyptian kings before him largely had done. He kept ruling and ruling. Decade after decade after decade, long after the very officials who had once managed his childhood regency had themselves grown old, retired, and eventually passed away in the natural order of things, one generation quietly replaced by the next beneath him. According to the ancient historian Manetho, writing well over 2,000 years after the fact using older records that no longer survive today, Pepi II's reign eventually stretched across 94 full years, which would make it the longest confirmed reign of any monarch anywhere in recorded human history. Modern Egyptologists actually dispute that exact number rather seriously, and for good reason. Some researchers argue the firmly attested archaeological evidence only supports a reign of somewhere around 62 to 64 years total, since no securely dated inscriptions have ever been found from later in his long rule. Whichever number turns out to be closer to the literal historical truth, both figures still describe something almost unheard of anywhere else in the ancient world. One single, unbroken reign lasting longer than most entire human lifespans of that era, back to back. And across that enormous, almost unimaginable stretch of time, something slow, quiet, and ultimately catastrophic was happening underneath the calm surface of Pepi's long and seemingly stable, unchanging rule. The regional governors of Egypt's various provinces, known as nomarchs, steadily grew more powerful, more financially independent, and more deeply entrenched with each passing decade that the same distant, aging pharaoh remained safely and unchangeably seated on his throne. Nomarch positions increasingly became hereditary, passed casually from father to son within the same powerful local families, rather than appointed and closely controlled directly by the central government back in Memphis, as had been standard practice only a few generations earlier. Perhaps most tellingly of all, these ambitious provincial governors began building their own elaborate, richly decorated tombs in their own home territories, instead of clustered near the pharaoh's pyramid complex, exactly as earlier Old Kingdom officials had almost universally done for generations before them. That single, seemingly small shift in burial practice actually speaks volumes about where real power had quietly relocated. These men no longer saw their ultimate legacy, loyalty, or lasting source of power as flowing primarily from the distant royal court at all anymore. Later in his extraordinarily long reign, an aging Pepi II made a decision that historians now recognize as a genuinely critical turning point. He formally split the once singular, powerful office of Vizier into two separate positions, one governing Upper Egypt and one governing Lower Egypt entirely on its own. What looked, at the time, like a perfectly reasonable administrative adjustment for an aging, increasingly sprawling kingdom was, in practice, a direct institutional admission that one single central authority could no longer effectively govern the entire unified Nile Valley on its own anymore. Trade expeditions and mining operations, once frequent, well-organized, and tightly coordinated under earlier 6th dynasty pharaohs, appear to have grown noticeably less frequent, less ambitious, and less centrally managed as Pepi's reign wore on further into its later decades. Some modern researchers also point to a period of weaker, less reliable Nile floods and broader regional climate stress during roughly this same era, adding still further economic pressure onto a central government that was already visibly losing its grip on the kingdom. None of these individual problems, taken entirely on their own, would necessarily have been enough by itself to destroy a civilization as wealthy, established, and historically resilient as Old Kingdom Egypt had become over the preceding several centuries. But there was no strong, energetic, reform-minded new pharaoh available anywhere to actually respond to any of it, correct course, or reassert real central control over the provinces, because the exact same aging king had simply never left the throne at all in all that time. Egypt spent decade after decade quietly drifting toward fragmentation, precisely during the one long stretch of its history when it also happened to enjoy its longest, most outwardly stable-looking run of unbroken royal continuity anyone could remember. Then, finally, at last, after somewhere between 62 and 94 remarkable years on the throne, Pepi II, the boy pharaoh who had simply never left, died. And almost immediately, the fragile illusion of stability that his sheer, unbroken longevity had projected for so long simply came apart at the seams. His son, Merenre-Nemtiemsaf II, took the throne next and ruled for barely more than a single short year before he too was gone, leaving Egypt suddenly without any clear, strong, obvious successor at all. After that brief, deeply uncertain reign, the throne likely passed to a ruler named Nitikriti-Siptah, a shadowy figure some historians connect to the later legendary Queen Nitocris, described centuries afterward by the Greek historian Herodotus and by Manetho alike. This rapid, chaotic turnover of short-lived rulers, one after another in quick and thoroughly confusing succession, effectively marks the final collapse of what had, until so recently, been the once mighty Old Kingdom of Egypt. What followed is known today to historians as the First Intermediate Period, roughly a century or more of ongoing political fragmentation, weakened central authority, and open conflict between rival regional power centers scattered across the Nile Valley. The very same nomarchs who had quietly grown rich, powerful, and thoroughly independent throughout Pepi's decades-long reign were now perfectly positioned to fill the sudden power vacuum his death had violently torn wide open. The empire didn't fall in one single dramatic moment that anyone living through it could easily point to and name at the time. It fell because it had already been slowly hollowed out from within, piece by piece, for decades and decades beforehand, largely out of sight. So what does the strange, singular story of Pepi II, the boy who became a king and simply never stopped being one, actually leave behind for us thousands of years later? Extremely long, unchanging leadership can look remarkably stable from the outside for a very long time, right up until the exact moment it very suddenly, and often irreversibly, isn't stable at all anymore. The real danger in Pepi's story was never one single bad decision, one lost battle, or one obvious crisis that later historians could conveniently point to and blame for everything. It was decades upon decades of small, quietly uncorrected drift, compounding steadily year after year after year, entirely unchecked by anyone with the power to stop it. A single unbroken reign, no matter how impressively long it lasts on paper or how record-breaking it eventually becomes, is simply not automatically the same thing as genuine, resilient institutional strength underneath it. Pepi II ruled longer than almost any other human being in all of recorded history, and in doing so, he unintentionally proved something genuinely uncomfortable, that simply refusing to ever leave the throne can be every bit as destructive, in the end, as violently losing it outright ever could. The real question his strange reign leaves behind isn't really how a king managed to rule for 94 uninterrupted years in the first place. It's what quietly breaks, piece by piece and year after year, in any system built to run entirely on the assumption that one unchanging person at the top will always be there.